So we move into the second part of the discussion of realism. This time we focus on British branch of realistic writing. We could also say we are going to focus on the British novel of 19th century, because it is in 19th century British literature that you would find a thorough and perfect blooming of a realist imagination. But it is also possible for us to see how some philosophical discourses that happened in early 18th century is responsible for kicking off the British branch of realism. As I said in the previous video, each region has its own logic and its own reason for arriving at realistic schools. In the case of France, that reason happened to be French Revolution. That reason happened to be the hatred against the so-called French Romantic School, the rebellion against Académie Française. This was the reason for kicking off realism in France, and realism in France was also obsessed with scientificity and objectivity. Now you will not find such factors, you will not find such forces operating behind the initiation of realist thought in England. The English realist school is not really as heroic as the French realist tradition is. Its relations with contemporary politics is also not as turbulent as the French tradition was. There is a way in which certain critics, especially Ian Watt, in his work The Rise of the Novel, tries to link the shift to realism in England with the philosophical schools of René Descartes and John Locke. Both these philosophers emphasized on how the perception of the world by the individual through senses is so important. Perceiving the world is essentially a function of the senses. It is not a function of your imagination. It is not a function of your meditation. It is basically a function of your senses. Watt would say that this break in philosophy would enable writers like Daniel Defoe, Samuel Richardson, or Henry Fielding to arrive at a new way of looking at the world. So they will have their characters, like Tom Jones for that matter, Moore Flanders for that matter, Clarissa for that matter, Pamela for that matter. These characters are focused by Ian Watt in his work as the beginning points of English realism. When you look at the larger picture, you would find that there are some other, perhaps more important reasons why British realism needs to be distinguished from its French counterpart. An important reason, an important factor would be the intervention of the women writers. Unlike the French realist movement, women writers and women readers made English realism a very special school of literary practice. Look at the huge vivae of women writers who appeared on the scene with the 19th century in England. Beginning from Jane Austen, proceeding through the Bronte sisters, to Elizabeth Gaskell, to George Eliot, you would find that, to Mary Shelley, you would find that there is this entire host of women writers who extended the way reality was coded in literature. They brought in a new definition of reality, and defining reality in new ways is so crucial to the school of realism. So naturally, British realism was much more powerful and to the point than French realist school. Thirdly, you would also find that there is this reason, in distinguishing, or this factor that distinguishes French realism from British realism. In that, in France, it was possible for us to see what alliance is what the Academy of Françoise was trying to do. There is a way in which neoclassical standards were strictly implemented by a certain institution. Now, the Romantic movement in France would go against that institution. The Realist movement would go against the Romantic notions. So there is a way in which this gradual evolution is traceable in French history. But this evolution becomes blurred, very blurred in British history. Because in the first half of 19th century, there was no notion that a Romantic school was actually developing in Britain. We now talk about Romantic school in Britain in retrospect. But in the beginning of the century, in the beginning of 19th century, with people like Blake, with people like Clare, it is difficult for us to understand that there is a movement actually forming in Britain. So naturally, there was no Romantic school, there was no powerful Romantic school against which the Realists were actually struggling. Plus, scientificity also was a major point of contention. So look at the way in which Blake or Carlyle would look at scientificity. Blake would say scientificity is an evil. Carlyle would say it is a threat to imagination. So this idea that scientificity is basically not a virtue would also influence British realism. If you look at French realism, the French realism believes that scientificity is a virtue. But by the time British realists are writing, scientificity is not being seen as a virtue. And the contentions between British romantics and British realists is not as well featured as it was in France. So these few points, should be taken into consideration before we actually move into a discussion of British realism. Now, moving into the actual blooming of British realism, moving into the 19th century, I said it is possible for us to consider Daniel Defoe as one of the earliest realist writers. We could also consider Samuel Richardson as a realist writer. Because they followed the Cartesian or the Lockean philosophies of sense perception, they focused on individuals' experience. So all those things would qualify them, all these things would qualify these writers as realist writers. But moving into the 19th century, it is the arrival of Charles Dickens that actually pioneered the most important phase of British realism. Dickens, like Stendhal, came from a background of journalism. It was possible for him to document, his earliest work, his first most important work, his first major work was Sketches by Boz, which is nothing but, the journalistic pieces that he wrote up. So these journalistic pieces were his impressions regarding the city of London and, the life of lower middle class and the poor and the peasants and factory workers in London. He was focusing on these aspects. And this focus is very important as far as realism is concerned. So Sketches by Boz is one of the major breaks in realistic writings. The ensuing list of novels, he was a very prolific writer, so you have a heavy load of writings by Dickens which would frame the very structure of British realistic novels. So you would have him moving into several stratas of society. You will have him moving into the bourgeois quarters. You will have him moving into the London's underbelly, the criminal underbelly of London. So you have pictures drawn from there. Dickens gives you a panorama of London life in 19th century. It is possible for us to see how society, observations on society, details that he draws from different classes in society, how these become crucial when it comes to depicting British realistic novels, when it comes to detailing, when it comes to discussing British realistic novels. These details are very important. City life becomes so important, and this is one major difference between perhaps the British romantics and the British realists, because British romantics would focus more on the rustic country life, whereas when it comes to realistic writing, they focus much on the London life, the city life. And this difference is perhaps, very crucial when we come to discuss the blooming of realist novels in Britain in the early half of 19th century. In fact, we should see that the early half of 19th century and its notions regarding realistic writing will come to be challenged later, especially when we come to the phase where George Eliot and Thomas Hardy are writing. Their ways of writing is completely different from the way Charles Dickens has written his realistic novels. British realistic tradition actually evolves. Unlike the French counterpart, there is a clear evolution of realistic imagination in Britain. And the contribution of women writers are also very important when we consider the British realism. When we consider French realism, we don't have a major women writer to name. But when we come to the British counterpart, we find that the extensions of reality, the extensions of perceptions from the women's point of view has been major, has been very influential, has been very crucial in defining the very outlook of our British realism. Moving further into the modalities of writing, moving further into the techniques of writing that the British realists adopted, we should look at how a certain branch of realism, which could be called social realism, was important for these writers. One of the major advocates of, or one of the major champions of this school of writing, of this specialized branch of realistic writing, would definitely be Charles Dickens, whose focus on society, whose focus on social issues, actually makes much of his plot element, in fact. Excepting a few novels like Great Expectations or Our Mutual Friend, almost all the other novels of Charles Dickens is also about certain facets of certain distinct facets of London social life. Look at William Makepeace Thackeray, for that matter, whose focus was also squarely the social life of a bourgeois in 19th century Britain. So this idea of relating novelistic writing with details from society, and the 19th century society, 19th century London society was rife with disparate elements. Like you have orphanages, you have chimney sweepers, you have newly installed factories, you have a new system of economics coming up, the first wave of capitalist development coming up. So there was a rich field for novelists to borrow from. It was possible for them to develop a point of view which did not exist before 19th century. And then focusing on the individual's psychological development. I mean, this we would connect to the psychological realism. We are talking about social realism, but psychological realism has also been in bloom in 19th century writing. We would find that most diligently taken up by the women writers. We would find that women writers weren't really interested in depicting the social realities of London during that particular time. From Jane Austen onwards, you have women writers turning to elements that French realism would actually try to keep away from realist writing. Look at Emily Bronte, for that matter, or look at Jane Eyre, the writer of Jane Eyre. Look at Charlotte Bronte, for that matter. Three Bronte sisters, or look at Mary Shelley, for that matter. What they bring into literature is the element of supernatural. So, an element of supernatural was essentially a method that was used by romantics. So the realist novel, the 19th century novel, ideally should not be taking up those elements, those factors, those plot elements. But you would find that most of the women writers in 19th century, they focused on depicting supernatural elements, they focused on bringing in ghosts, they focused on bringing in science fiction elements into their work, they focused on bringing Gothic elements into their work, and this also would make a difference as far as British realism is concerned. The critics Eric Auerbach and George Lucas, two seminal critics who analyze the history of novel, history of realist novel, would argue that English realism, British realism, was distinct in two more aspects, two more dimensions. In English realism, you would find that individuals are identified as forces, social forces, places where social forces come into contradiction. places where social forces come into conflict. And English realists would also look at individual as a space where these conflicts would be resolved successfully. Another facet that they focus upon is, another facet they foreground is that in English realism, the lives of the lower class, the working class, has been described in much detail. So even though the national history of Britain has not been as eventful as that of France, you will still find that the focus on the lower class, the focus on the working class, has been so crucial. Identifying criminal tendencies, identifying decadence, identifying purity, identifying virtue, identifying poverty as a breeding ground of social attitudes. So this is so crucial, and this is something that has been so richly explored by 19th century British realists. In fact, it is possible for us to see how the criminal minds depicted by Charles Dickens would eventually become studies of criminality that Dostoevsky would take up in Russia. So Charles Dickens in fact is the pioneer in understanding criminality that connects itself with class-based realities. So how class consciousness, how poverty, how social realities become forces that would dictate elements of realism. This is again a major achievement. This is again a major feature of British realism, says Eric Orbach. So you have some detailing, some what do I say? Some further descriptions of British realist fiction in George Lucas, whose neo-Marxist ideas would understand English fiction, British realist fiction, as the ideal form of, as the perfect form of, as the most evolved form of realist fiction in the entire Europe. He says that because the class consciousness that this fiction shows, and the involvement of women in creating the cultural consciousness of realism in Britain, how that happens, he finds that to be extremely important. He finds that to be extremely relevant to the discussion of realism. And he would say, unlike Russia, unlike Germany, unlike France, British realism is the perfect evolution of realist novel, because realist novel, according to Lukács and according to neo-Marxist perspective, realism is the perfect medium. Realism is perhaps the most important, perhaps the most capable medium of expressing class conflicts and class consciousness. You will find that from Eliot, you have George Eliot. From George Eliot onwards, you have the decline of British realism, where class consciousness is slowly getting diluted into psychological consciousness. You would find that in George Eliot, but in a more intense way, you would find this dissolution of class consciousness into individual destinies in Thomas Hardy. So in Thomas Hardy, in George Eliot, Lukács would find that British realism was actually on the way out. So the blooming of British realism would be in Elizabeth Gaskell, in Charles Dickens, in Anthony Trollope. So this particular focus that is applied by George Lucas is therefore very important when we discuss the development of British realism in 19th century. Moving on to the final part of discussions of British realism, we should now look at certain major aspects, major features through which we can identify realistic writing. So maybe you can call this a sum up. Let us look at what are the major features, what are the major aspects of realistic writing in Britain that could be called their fundamental properties. So there are at least 4 different aspects to realist writing that you need to keep in mind. One is the emphasis on the particular at the expense of universal truth. We have already discussed that. So when you discuss something like an individual truth, how do you understand individual truth? What exactly is individual truth all about? You could see that most of the realist novels use the technique of omniscient narrator. An omniscient narrator is like a god, is like an impassive observer who looks at the dramatic turns that happens in the characters' lives, but refuses to comment. So you have an omniscient narrator there. You have also this idea of details that they take up. Putting up as much detail as they can, as many details as they can into the pages of a realist novel is important. I mean, the huge volumes of realist fiction that were written in 19th century. Look at the size of the novels written by Tolstoy, for that matter. Look at the size of the novels by Dickens or Anthony Trollope. You would find that there is so much detail that goes into the writing of a realist novel. Everything that they see around them, there is a way in which they detail it. It's not really photography. It is not really a scientific way of charting out or surveying stuff, but there is a way in which a novelist is interested in what is present in a room, what is present on a street, what is present in a city, a countryside. There is a way in which instead of giving you a value, they would prefer to give you a picture and then let you decide what the value actually is. Let you decide what the message actually is. So this is one way of one way of intervention that realist depictions or realist writing made. And proceeding with other factors, you have formal experimentation. This is again another important factor with realistic writing. As a formal experimentation is usually a detail that we connect to modernist writers or experimental writers. In their writings, we say techniques like stream of consciousness or techniques like multiple narrators or techniques like meta-narratives. Now that would qualify as formal experimentation for a modern reader, for a contemporary reader. But to be fair to the 19th century realists, we should understand that formal experimentation was a major fact, a major attitudinal position that they took up consciously in their writing. If we look at the language structure in novels by Elizabeth Gaskell, for that matter, or even Dickens, for that matter, we would find that they would use dialect variations. Which part of London, which part of Britain is in focus? Well, that part speaks what kind of dialect? So this is also, one major achievement that a realist novel has, realist novelists could, garner in 19th century. They focused on dialects, linguistic experimentation in other words. How language is important, and in modernist writing also, language becomes one of the major points of contention. How language could be used to understand the consciousness of a character. How language is seminal in expressing the perception of a character. So in the same manner, in 19th century also, instead of using what is generally taken to be standard English, all the major novelists of 19th century Britain, they focused on dialectical variations. So you would find Elizabeth Gaskell using dialectical variations, you would find Dickens using dialectical variations. Very famously, you have George Eliot using dialectical variations in all her novels, and dialect becomes one of the important tropes, important motifs in writing Victorian realist fiction. We should also think about how the narrator's perspective, the omniscient narrator's perspective, was also a major component of formal experimentation. If you look at 18th century novels, if you look at early forms of novels, you would find that in novels of Henry Fielding, for that matter, you have a heavy-handed author talking about the principles, talking about the moral sides of characters. Somebody constantly commenting to us helping us form our judgments about characters. You have that in early novels, but in 19th century realist novel you don't have that. The omniscient narrator is of course there, but the nature of omniscient narrator has changed forever. The omniscient narrator is now not an intrusive narrator. He is an invisible narrator. We feel as if we are transparently moving through the narrative. Nobody is guiding us through the narrative. Nobody is making judgments about the characters. No one is giving us a value system that we ought to follow. No one depicts tragedy as, or no one comments on a certain person's tragedy as tragic. No one comments on a certain social evil as evil. Instead, the omniscient narrator in the 19th century realist tradition is impassionate. He's not involved in this thing at all. He removes himself from the scene and then gives you a commentary. He gives you a commentary that is completely silent about his own positions about what is happening in the story. So this is another formal innovation that happened in 19th century realist fiction. Another important facet of 19th century realist novel in Britain is that it brought novel to the forefront of literary writing. And this is important because even in the early 19th century you would find that novels were seen as second-rate literature. They were seen as, they were derogated as secondary literature. They were not standard literary writing. Standard literary writing happened to be poetry and of course drama. So if you are not a good playwright, if you are not a good drama writer, if you are not a good poet, you are not considered to the credit of a literary practitioner. But 19th century realist novelists changed this scenario. They found that novel as a form could actually command literary merit. So they brought novel to the forefront of literary merit. And finally, perhaps we should also look at how 19th century realists aligned themselves with the new market trends, how commercialization of literature became so important, how it was possible for them to free themselves from aristocratic patronage and come to benefit from the profits of book selling their books to the market at large, writing bestsellers for that matter. It was another way of earning revenue from literature, which did not exist before. So writing novels in series, writing a novel that has 30 chapters, ensured them ready publication in journals and magazines which were so popular during that time. It also gave them a footing in the newly emergent capitalistic environment, social environment. So it was possible for them to generate revenue out of writing. And this should also be read along with the fact that the new reading public and their attitudes regarding what the novelist needs to write, this started dictating the way novels were written. So showing bourgeois in a poor light, for that matter, showing a certain class as virtuous, for that matter, all those actually came into question. So the question of class consciousness is key to the understanding of 19th century realist novels. We should also talk about, when we talk about commercial demands of the mass market, as I'm trying to say, it's also about rise in literacy. So literacy was not something that is available to the general public before 19th century. So you would find that the reform bills that came in series through the 19th century, it made universal male suffrage possible. It also made literacy a reality, a mass reality. So when you have a literate mass, you need to write for that particular mass. So there has to be a supply because there is a demand. So in that manner, 19th century novels, 19th century realist writings actually made a thorough mark in the newly evolved market conditions in Britain. So these are some of the aspects that you would do good to keep in your mind when we discuss the 19th century Victorian novel and its features. Maybe we should focus on how detailing of the scenery is important, how omniscient narrator is important, how the dialectical focus is important, how the verisimilitude is. I didn't talk about that particular point. Verisimilitude also is a major factor, major component in realist writing, in 19th century realist writing. You can pick out a few novels, you can pick out a few realist novels where verisimilitude is not clearly followed, but on a general scale, almost all the novels reproduced the literary, the social scenario that existed in London during 19th century. Instead of moving back into this 17th century or moving into the 20th century for science fiction, they basically grounded themselves in 19th century English context and started writing their fiction. I mean, it's a usual practice in romantic writing. It's a usual practice in science fiction writing, for that matter, to step back a few decades or centuries and give you a story. But none of these major novels in 19th century does that. They don't believe in going back in time and presenting you a historical epoch. They rather believe in documenting the present, and that is also one important point when it comes to 19th century realist fiction. So these are a few things that you would do good to remember about British realist fiction. Thank you.